Hey everybody, welcome to American Rambler. I am your host, Colin Woodward. Welcome to the third podcast. Yes, this is number 3, and I think pretty soon I might have more podcast episodes than actual listeners. I'm just kidding. I think there's more than 3 out there. Hopefully, I don't know. I'm kind of tracking the hits on the various websites, and not a lot of traffic yet, but I hope people will start listening. I think I've got a guest coming up pretty soon, a friend of mine named Graham Dozier, who works at the Virginia Historical Society. He's also a published historian. He has published a book in the last year on a Confederate officer, and as a fellow historian and former colleague of mine, I hope to talk to him soon. Not sure what we're going to talk about. Maybe just talk about the publishing process and what authors have to go through these days to get something published through an academic press. I hope that'll be interesting, but we haven't set anything up definite. A few emails back and forth, and hopefully either I can see Graham soon or he'll see me soon, and we can get our first interview going here on American Rambler. What's been going on? Well, I just came back from a bit of a trip, went up to the Northeast to see my family. First time I've driven up there in a while. I used to live in Arkansas, and now that I'm back on the East Coast and in Virginia, it's much easier to see family. Certainly the family in Virginia, but also the family up in New England. About an 8-hour drive there and back. This time did not have to go through DC, which is very nice. Hate the DC traffic. It's awful. So we didn't have to hit 95 until we were in the Baltimore area. So that was good. It's a little stop and go until we hit Baltimore. But really the drive from Baltimore up to Massachusetts isn't too bad. As always, the traffic in Connecticut was shitty, slow going. Once you get out of New York City, ironically, you can get through New York City pretty quickly. I think because people in New York City have places to be and they want to get there fast, and so you can zip right on through. Not that we saw a lot of New York City, mostly just the Bronx. You go up the Jersey Turnpike on 95, cut through the Bronx, and then next thing you know, you're in Connecticut, and it just feels like one big city, Connecticut, one big ball of awful city traffic, and it all just starts to look the same after a while. I can't tell one city from another until I hit Hartford, and then that's pretty much your last big city that you're going to hit in Connecticut. And then once you get through Hartford, it's not very long until you're in Massachusetts. So anyway, survived the trip. Like I said, it was about 8 hours up, 8 hours back. Weather was nice in Massachusetts, which is very rare for this time of year. There was no snow. There was not rain, not much rain, a little bit of drizzle. It was kind of foggy some days. But the weather was actually very nice up there. Again, for New England in December, can't ask for much. And it was in the 50s, pretty mild, which is good because a lot of people up there don't really like to crank the heat up. Or if they do, it's just tough because if it's so cold, you can only do so much after a certain while to make it warm without spending $1 million on your heating bill. So that was good. Saw the family, my kids, saw my brother's kids. They had fun. That was good. Had a short trip to Northampton, Mass., my former stomping grounds. Used to work at Smith College. Not very long, about a year or so. But always loved Northampton. Great to go up there, see the street musicians, see the freaky people, see people shopping in the downtown, the great downtown they have up there. Had brunch at a pretty good diner called, I think it's Bluebell Diner. I should know. I've been there a number of times. But it's my favorite diner in Northampton. Had a nice meal. It was Eggs Benedict on corned beef hash, and had some home fries with that, and that was really good. Made the trip of over an hour to get to Northampton to have breakfast, and it was definitely worth it. Always loved going there. Got a couple records, and made me think that I should probably have a music podcast pretty soon. Not going to talk about music today. I would like to, but I want to talk a little bit about Christmas before it's too late. Not so much Christmas, but Christmas movies and how they relate to the crass struggle. America often has a crass struggle, I'll say. No, the class struggle in America. But before I talk about Christmas movies, and to continue my streak of talking about movies, I did see a movie while I was up in Massachusetts, a new movie, which I don't often get to do these days. Saw the new Rocky movie, which is not called Rocky 7, but Creed. And if you're wondering why is it called Creed, it is about the son of Apollo Creed. And if you know the Rocky movies, Apollo Creed was Rocky's very first opponent, played by a black actor named Carl Weathers. And he, of course, has a son that's African American in this movie, and he sort of carries on. He carries the torch from Rocky. Rocky becomes his trainer, and it's a bit of a long story about why he wants Rocky to train him. But essentially, because Rocky fought his father, he figured that he can learn something from Rocky, and so he seeks him out in Philadelphia, even though Creed's son is in Los Angeles when the movie starts. It is, of course, a little contrived, but it is a Rocky movie. It is a formula. And I thought it was pretty good, actually. It certainly does follow the formula, but steers clear of some really cornball, cliched moments, or at least doesn't make them too bad. There is a hospital scene in this movie. I don't think I'm giving away anything to say that Rocky does get sick in this movie. I won't say what happens to him exactly, but there is a hospital scene, as there seems to be in every Rocky movie, I think, from the second movie onward. I haven't seen all the Rocky movies. I didn't see the fifth one. I didn't see the sixth one. But there usually someone either gets sick or dies in every Rocky movie. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, but after the first movie, people seem to be getting sick or dying in all the Rocky movies. And this one does follow that formula, but it was pretty good. It was played by the main character, Creed's son, played by an actor who was in The Wire. I can't remember his name, but he was one of the kids in The Wire, and you know, he's grown up in this movie. It looks like he's about 30. Probably when he was in The Wire, he was about 15. That's how long ago The Wire was. But he did a good job, and Sylvester Stallone, of course, is in it, and he does his Rocky thing, and you know, it was pretty good. It did have some good dramatic moments, and you just can't really knock those Rocky movies too hard. I mean, it's hard to resist, really. You know, it has a kind of an uplifting message on the whole. And I got to give it to Sylvester Stallone for just cranking out these movies. He's made you know, Rambos and Rockies and Expendables movies in the last 10 years have done pretty well at the box office. And I don't know how old he is now. He must be getting near 70, but you know, he's still in good shape and still making entertaining movies. And Creed, you know, it's probably a bit belated that you know, they decided to make a black character at the center of the movie, but it was pretty effective, and there's a little bit of a love story that's done pretty well, pretty realistic about how, you know, people meet and some issues they have when they're dating. But obviously the movie's about the big fight scene, and it's not quite up to par with the earlier Rocky movies, but you know, what could they really do to top some of the fight scenes in those earlier movies, which are pretty astounding. So saw that movie, enjoyed it, looking forward to the new Star Wars movie. And if you're interested in hearing me talk about the Star Wars franchise, you can check out episode 2 of the podcast and hear what I have to say about what it was like growing up a Star Wars kid in the Star Wars generation and how we're still kind of living that out 40 years later. Yeah, I am looking forward to the new Star Wars movie, but I think even more so I'm looking forward to the new Tarantino movie, The Hateful Eight, which looks like a Western crossed with a murder mystery, but I'm not sure how accurate that is. I've only seen a couple trailers and don't really want to read up on it because I don't want to know too much about it going in. But if it's like any other Tarantino movies, it's gonna have some surprises, and when you think it's over, there's probably going to be 45 more minutes to go, and a lot of violence and grotesque characters and all that. It's kind of interesting that Tarantino is doing these period pieces. I wonder if he's ever going to come back into the 21st century. I'm sure he will, but the last couple of movies have been set back in time, and I think he's wise to stick with the American West this time rather than do something like in Inglourious Bastards, where he was in Europe during World War II. Inglourious Bastards had some good things about it, but I definitely like Django better because it was set in the South, and I think Tarantino's a little bit more at home with something like that. And not all Tarantino movies have been great, but they've all been pretty different from each other, and so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the new one. More of an ensemble movie, but his stalwarts, Samuel L. Jackson is in it, some other people that have been in a lot of his movies, going back to Reservoir Dogs, so that should be good. Like I said, I got a little bit of a cold. I don't know if you can hear it. You can hear me sniffling. It seems like everybody's getting sick right now. Everybody at home is sick. And a lot of people were sick when I was visiting up in the Northeast. It's just one of those things with winter. You're sick all the time. And not only does everyone start getting sick in December, but it's the time of year when people have to go to gatherings that are indoors, multiple gatherings, where everyone is in close quarters, breathing on each other, and it's no wonder we get sick. But the holidays help us through it, and it seems like Halloween was just a couple days ago, and here we are looking at Christmas soon, and then it'll be New Year's. Another holiday we are in close quarters, and even kissing is encouraged on New Year's, so you can spread some more germs that way if you so choose. But obviously Christmas is coming soon. I gotta stop saying obviously. I do listen to the podcast before I put them online, and the last one I was listening to, and I was like, God, how many damn times am I gonna say obviously in this podcast? It was like getting to be a drinking game. I was saying it so much, so trying to cut down on that. I think another word, amazing, I was maybe overusing a bit, so I'm gonna work on that one too. So I want to talk a little bit about movies and what they kind of mean in terms of American culture, more specifically the class struggle in America. And I don't want to get too heavy into that and the sociological aspects of film, but I think there are a couple movies are obviously they're ostensibly about Christmas, but they say more about how people relate to each other, and more specifically the class structure in different societies. And I think one of the most obvious examples of this is in A Christmas Carol. And there have been a ton of movies made on the Dickens story of A Christmas Carol. And I think it's pretty obvious, what that story is trying to say. It's not just talking about Christmas, but talking about redemption and how this man Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a miser and was withholding all this money from people, eventually sort of sees the light and realizes that he needs to be more generous. He needs to treat his employer, Bob Cratchit, better. And if Bob Cratchit is treated better, he can care better for his family. Tiny Tim, he can get him the operation and so on. And Dickens is writing in the Victorian era when you had a pretty free market system going in England. There was probably sharper differences between rich and poor than there would be in later generations in England. You got the Industrial Revolution going on, kind of full steam in the mid-19th century. Not a lot of safety net for poor people, and Dickens knew this firsthand. He had a lot of bills to pay. He had a big family. He had to write a lot to survive. And anyone who was walking around London at that time could see the obvious differences between rich and poor. And I think London probably showed that more than just about any city in the world at the time. It was a big city, and it's a kind of reputation for being dark and dreary and industrial. And Dickens knew how to tap into that. And Christmas Carol has really translated well over time, I think. It's a great story, but it does sort of tap into that need that people have to feel reassured that there is hope. That now, you could read the story a number of ways. On the one hand, it's sort of a story in the liberal tradition, humanitarian tradition of people need to look after each other, and if they have too much money, they need to sort of redistribute it and give it to the poor people that need it. And so, at one level, A Christmas Carol can be seen as a kind of tale of the left. But on the other hand, you could read it as a story where the guy with the money, Scrooge, sort of sees the error of his ways and becomes a more responsible employer and more responsible person in kind of the tradition of the great conservative tradition, where it's all about the rich people making decisions that better society. Because Scrooge, to use the modern day term, is a job creator, and even though he's an evil man at the beginning of the story, the story is about him, focuses on him and the changes that come about with him, because he wasn't such a bad guy when he first started out, and it's just over time he became this miserly person. But he does see the error of his ways and changes. And so at one level, Christmas Carol is kind of a classic story of the individual. There, at no point in the story is it about the big government stepping in to provide a safety net for everyone in A Christmas Carol, because it just didn't really exist back then. And really, you will never see that in a Hollywood movie. You will never see the government portrayed as a positive entity, pretty much. I can't think of one movie where that happens. Now, there are movies where there's maybe a guy in the FBI or the CIA or the president who is maybe does something heroic. But if you look at a lot of Hollywood movies, the government is portrayed pretty badly. Usually, there's some kind of evil um, stirring in the government whenever it's portrayed. You always kind of have these guys in suits and glasses who are these evil bureaucrats who are going to deceive and try to destroy someone who is the hero. And I don't know if people still talk about this anymore, but some years ago, you used to hear a lot about limousine liberals and how people like Alec Baldwin were destroying America from inside Hollywood, and Hollywood was depicted as this very liberal place. And I think really, if you think about it and you look at movies, the vast majority of them, the message is pretty conservative. Again, it's never about Keynesian economics and the Great Society and the New Deal and things like that. Socialism is never ever seen as the answer to anything in a Hollywood movie. It's always about individuals and heroic people. The government again never is supposed to, is the heroes stepping in to save the day, because who would want to watch a movie about that? No, they'd rather watch a movie about Indiana Jones or Jimmy Stewart doing something heroic, or John Wayne and the great westerns of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Doing things on their own. The Lone Rider, the sheriff, who is sort of a symbol of authority, but certainly not big government. So I think someone needs to write a book sometime about how Hollywood actually reinforces conservative values, and that's kind of a way of segueing to another movie that I think is one of my favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life. And I think when you first watch It's a Wonderful Life, you probably watch it around Christmas time because it's on a lot, or at least it used to be. It's a great black and white movie made a couple years after World War II, starring Jimmy Stewart. And if you don't know the movie, it's about this guy, Jimmy Stewart, who is from a small town in upstate New York somewhere. And he is sort of a man living a life of quiet desperation, at least up until the last 30 minutes of the movie. He has a job that he doesn't like. He works at this, it's called the Bailey Building and Loan, that the job he inherited from his father. And early in the movie, his father dies, and Jimmy Stewart, who plays this guy named George Bailey, has to take over the business. And again, he doesn't want to do that. He wanted to go to college. He wanted to be a builder. He wanted to be an architect or engineer. I can't remember exactly what he wanted to do, but he kind of wanted to do everything. And he wanted to get out of this small town and go to college and travel and see the world. And as the movie starts, he's just about to leave when his father has a stroke. And then he runs a business for a few years. His brother comes home, and his brother comes home from college and is supposed to take over the business, but his brother gets married, doesn't tell anyone, and he ends up taking another job, and so George stays at this building alone. Now, a lot of things happen in the movie, but it's a classic kind of Jimmy Stewart as every man. He takes on this evil landlord in the movie named Mr. Potter, who is pretty much the Ebenezer Scrooge character to Jimmy Stewart's Bob Cratchit. Even though in the movie Jimmy Stewart's character doesn't work for this guy, he's sort of under the thumb of this more powerful real estate owner in this town, and so they sort of battle back and forth throughout the movie. And later on in the movie, George, something goes wrong. His uncle, who was supposed to deposit some money for him at the bank, loses the money, and George realizes that since they lost this money, there's going to be discrepancy in their accounting, and he worries he's going to go to jail. Mr. Potter finds out about the money being lost and has George arrested for embezzlement and so on and so forth. So Jimmy Stewart reaches the point where he's suicidal. And not to give too much away, but he thinks about killing himself, where he is saved in a Christmas miracle by his guardian angel, who shows him what life would have been like for him and this small town if George had never been born. And the last 45 minutes of the movie or so takes George through this alternate reality where he sees what would have happened to people had he not been there to save them, either literally or sort of figuratively. And it is a little bit melodramatic, but it's kind of a classic Christmas movie. And at the end of the movie, the whole community comes together and saves George. They're able to repay the money that he had lost, and he doesn't have to go to jail. And it's a very kind of moving ending to the movie. And again, when I think you first see It's a Wonderful Life, you get wrapped up in the Christmas scenes and just the look of the movie. It's a black and white movie that was directed by Frank Capra, who was, he was a director during the World War II era. He directed propaganda movies during World War II. Obviously, he was a very gung-ho American with a lot of conservative values. And the thing about It's a Wonderful Life is I think it's a great movie for a lot of reasons. Certainly, Jimmy Stewart's performance really puts the movie over the top, but it's just got so many great scenes in it. But it's one of those movies that if you keep watching it, and this is true of a lot of great movies, if you keep watching it, you'll go back and you'll find something that you liked, that you didn't like before, or maybe didn't think about before. And I think as I get older, the sort of George as the family man struggling to get by is what appeals to me more than the fantasy elements toward the end of the movie. And that's kind of what's interesting about both It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol, is that these guys that made it needed to insert an element of the supernatural to kind of make the class message go down a bit easier. In Christmas Carol, you have the ghosts who visit Ebenezer Scrooge, and in It's a Wonderful Life, you have the angel named Clarence come down to visit Jimmy Stewart. And I don't know how much It's a Wonderful Life was drawing on A Christmas Carol, maybe a bit, because there are those elements. Again, the Mr. Potter character is really just an Ebenezer Scrooge. Jimmy's kind of the Bob Cratchit. He's got a bunch of kids. He's got a wife, and he's trying to support them on not a whole lot of money. And every day he's going out there fighting the good fight in this community during real hard times, the Depression, World War II. He doesn't have a lot of support. The uncle who works for him, the uncle who loses the $8,000, is kind of a bumbling idiot. So George is going it alone, doing it because it was his father's business, but also because he realizes that if he doesn't fight Mr. Potter and stick up for the working class people in the town, that they're all pretty much going to be screwed, and Mr. Potter's just going to buy up the entire town and turn everything into casinos and slummy apartments. At least that's the way the fantasy scenes make it look. Again, it's kind of over the top, and I used to joke sometimes that if it wasn't for George Bailey, maybe the Germans would have won the war, because George goes to his cemetery and he sees his brother who would have died had George not saved him from the ice when he was a child, and the angel says, well, all the men on the transport died during World War II because your brother wasn't there to shoot the kamikaze pilot out of the sky. Ergo, I think, then maybe the Allies would have just lost World War II entirely were it not for George Bailey. And that's just me being obnoxious. But obviously the message is that one guy's life means a great big difference, and who knows what could happen if one person wasn't there fighting for the common people in the town. And it's a great message. It's a powerful message. Again, Jimmy Stewart is so likable, and he does have that everyman quality. What's kind of funny is how old he was when he made this movie. I think he was in his 40s. He, in the earlier scenes, he does pretty convincingly look like someone young. Maybe high schooler is a bit of a stretch, but actually in some scenes he can kind of pull it off. Maybe that's the black and white film effect, the silver screen effect of everyone kind of looking younger and more glamorous than they would in a color movie. But they did do a pretty good job of making Jimmy look more haggard and kind of older and scruffier later in the movie when things get more desperate for him. So it kind of the movie starts out kind of light and comedic, and then gets very dark toward the end. Again, much like A Christmas Carol, which is a pretty dark story in a lot of ways. But I think, It's a Wonderful Life. It's one of those classic movies, again, for so many reasons, but I think it does speak a lot to the class problems that were existent in the 1940s, but maybe are even worse today. It's kind of funny how we don't see movies like It's a Wonderful Life anymore. And maybe there are some indie movies here and there where there is some kind of blue collar struggle or David Goliath struggle. That you do see movies like that now and then, where someone like a lawyer or activist, Aaron Brockovich maybe is kind of an example of someone sticking up for the community against powerful forces. But I think those types of movies are very much in the minority these days, and something like Aaron Brockovich is again different, and then it's sort of focusing on this one character, played by Julia Roberts, rather than the community. And It's a Wonderful Life is really more about the community. I mean, George Bailey, again, he, if George hadn't lived, all these bad things would have happened. So the angel tells him, but really it's the community that kind of comes together at the end to save him and support him. So it's definitely more of a message about community values as much as individual values. And this is an interesting thing to think about, class in America, because we are programmed to not think that there's any kind of warfare going on between the classes. And maybe compared to other countries, there really hasn't been in this country, at least not to the extent of Russia and the battles there between the Bolsheviks and the ruling elite and the working class and the aristocracy, because we never had an actual aristocracy in this country, and in many ways we were a lot more democratic from the beginning than other countries have been. But I think the further away, because as a historian, my focus has usually been more on race. Race matters. I wrote a whole book about race. That was my first book, and you're talking about the Civil War and the Confederacy. I think race is central to that story. Class does play a lot into it, but you're talking more about the white South. And I think the story of America is in many ways the story of race and race relations. But I think the further you get away from the civil rights movement, Not to discount the importance of race in America today. I think it's still very important, but I think these class issues maybe bubble up a bit more, and we can talk about class in a way differently than we could, 50, 60, 100 years ago, certainly. Just for the record, I think race relations in this country is pretty bad. It's better than, again, it was 100 years ago, but I think it's pretty bad, and the riots and we've had in the past year and a half, and the police shootings and every other thing are evidence of how bad the race problem still is. But at the same time, I think we can talk about class in a way that we couldn't before. And an example of that, if we talk about the working class in this country, I think you are including people of different races that do a certain type of job. You are talking about black factory workers, white factory workers, Latino workers, working industry or service industry or whatever. You're not necessarily focusing on certain racial groups. Now, again, race plays a big role in a lot of the conversations we have about this country. But I think, and when we talk about class, we can be more inclusive than we used to be. Now, what does that mean for a movie like It's a Wonderful Life? I guess now we can kind of see it as this movie about class and the difficulty that someone had during the Depression or during World War II just to get by. And in a lot of ways, that resonates more now than it might have 10 or 20, 30 years ago. In the 80s and 90s, when those times when the economy was booming, it seemed like the Depression was something that would never happen again. It could never possibly happen, and we hadn't been in a major war since Vietnam. And now, after 9/11, the Iraq War, and the Depression that we suffered in 2008, 2009, you start to realize that maybe this class thing is real, and that we maybe need to be a little bit worried about where we're going in terms of our economic vision for this country. How we're going to treat poor people, the middle class. Do we need to relook at how wealth is redistributed and things like that? So watching a movie like It's a Wonderful Life, and in my own life, having trouble paying bills and always worrying about money, and just seeing the cost of rent and how expensive it is, and how expensive healthcare is, and you start to wonder sometimes about where are we really going as a society? Are we truly looking after each other? Are we going the way of George Bailey, or are we going more the way of Mr. Potter? And again, it's easy to be not tricked, but you see the Christmas scenes in It's a Wonderful Life, and you just see it as a Christmas movie that maybe you see at the end of the year. But it really kind of talks to these ongoing issues in America about wealth, and how our society is structured. And in a lot of ways, the Bedford Falls, the town where George Bailey lives in It's a Wonderful Life, is kind of a relic of the past. But in other ways, it isn't. If you look at a mid-sized city, in places like I've lived, in Little Rock or Richmond, Hartford, these are not big cities, so they don't have the draw that certain bigger cities do, like Boston or New York or Chicago. And they're always kind of worrying about the economic fallout on a place that maybe doesn't have much of a manufacturing base, doesn't have a huge draw of tourists. What are they supposed to do exactly? Is the issue with a lot of towns, and I live in a town like that now, in Colonial Beach. It's a small community. It's only about 3,000 people, and it can't really decide whether it wants to be a retirement community. Does it want to be a resort community like it was in its heyday? It has this biker fest in the fall. At least it's had it for the last couple of years, and it does have some music, live music, in the good weather, and is able to draw people to the beach and stuff. But it also, maybe wants to be a place for people to retire and spend their retirement money. And so there's a bit of a split here. And again, these is relatively small stakes in a town of 3,000 people, but it does kind of speak to this larger issue of, small town survival. And this is not a town that has a lot of high-paying jobs. A lot of people that work around here work at the military bases. There's the service industry people. Some people that work in other towns and commute. I don't know what a lot of people do around here. That, again, people that are retired are not really working, so they're not generating the kind of money that the bigger cities people there generate. So there are a lot of towns like this, old towns that maybe were factory towns, or maybe they were agricultural towns back in the day. I mean, when I was in Arkansas, you had a lot of these old cotton towns that have just become ghost towns, really. And maybe it was probably naive for them to put a lot of faith in the cotton economy back in the day. But, that's what these towns did. They grew cotton. And, now things have been either, you have agribusiness doing it, or it's been shipped overseas. And, people that used to work on farms don't do that anymore. They work at Walmart. And, there are a million different ways you can go with this whole issue of class and how it affects people. But it's not something that a lot of people really talk about in academic circles. And some do, but when I was in graduate school, about as far into a class discussion we got was the whole issue of what's more important in American society. Is it about race, or is it about class? And I had always kind of been on the side of race, at least on a lot of issues, leading up to the Civil War and beyond. But like I said, as we get further away from the civil rights movement, I think this class issue is becoming more important. And people of different races can certainly get together and pound these class issues in a way that they couldn't before, which is a good thing. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm for labor causes, and a lot of the things that we enjoy, the 40-hour work week and sick leave and workman's compensation and all that, are things that came out of the labor movement. And even though I'm not a labor historian, I have a lot to thank the labor movement for. I mean, people used to work 60, 80-hour weeks like it was nothing in the 19th century or early 20th century. So, thank God those days are gone. Thank God, our kids are in school rather than in factories. But we're just not in a place right now where anyone is pushing for any kind of reforms that will really help working people, and that's kind of a shame. And so it's kind of easy to get nostalgic for a movie like It's a Wonderful Life and and see Jimmy Stewart as this fighting man for his town, and standing up to the evil guy with all the money. And there's a great scene where Mr. Potter brings George into his office and offers to pay him $20,000 a year to work for him. And in the 1940s, $20,000 a year was a phenomenal amount of money. But George sees that this is really the temptation of Satan. Mr. Potter's taken him up to the mountain and showed him the kingdom below and say, this can be yours if you'll just follow me. And George tells him off, though not before George takes one of Mr. Potter's cigars. And it's a really great scene because of the psychology involved. When George comes in, Mr. Potter is sitting in this chair behind a big desk, and George sits down in a chair in front of him, and the chair is bolted very close to the floor, so George can barely see over the desk at Mr. Potter. And even though Mr. Potter is in a wheelchair, he obviously wants a psychological advantage by making George look small. And Jimmy Stewart is a big actor, and in the movie he's taller than most of the people, but Mr. Potter sits him in this little chair, and George kind of squirms around and tries to get comfortable. And it's a really great scene, and Lionel Barrymore as Mr. Potter is just so good, as being this just complete bastard who wants to monopolize the town and do it just really for the sake of money and power. So he really is just kind of a thoroughly evil man. But the scene is good because Mr. Potter at first is very nice to George because he sees him as a threat. George is the up-and-coming business owner in town, and Mr. Potter tries to win him over, not through brute force, but to kind of suck him in with his money and take him under his wing as an employee. And God knows what would happen if he actually do that. And George at first is kind of seduced. It's got this great offer of $20,000 a year and vacations to Europe and New York City and all that, and living in a very nice house and buying nice things for his wife. But as the scene goes on, you can see that George is reluctant, and Mr. Potter starts to get very frustrated. And George shakes his hand and says, "Well, I'll think on it." But in the act of shaking Mr. Potter's hand, he kind of has this revulsion, like he's shaking the hand of a lizard or something. And then he has this turnaround and tells Mr. Potter off and storms out. And not only is that a great scene in a movie full of many great scenes, but we see George go home that night, and there's all these things that are going through his mind, and a voiceover. He thinks back to when he was young, and he was telling his wife all these great things that he was going to do. He's going to build bridges and railroads and tall skyscrapers and everything. And he seems so sure of himself. And I think that relates to anyone who's young. And when you're young, you pretty much know everything, or you think you do. And when you start to hit your 30s and 40s, you realize that you don't know a whole lot, or what you do know is pretty insignificant compared to what's going on in the world. And hopefully you're someone like George who has a decent job and is married and has kids. But George is coming home that night after turning down the offer from Mr. Potter, and that's when his wife tells him that she's pregnant. And George never really articulates it, but he must have been thinking, I just turned down this great job offer, and now I have a kid, and things were tight before, and now they're going to be even tighter. So it's a good scene. And George starts having kids, and there's another great scene where it kind of mixes George's success with his frustration. There's a scene where George is at a housewarming for one of his clients, I guess you could call him, Mr. Martini, who very appropriately by his name owns a bar in town, owns a tavern, and he's getting his first house that George helped him build because George owns the building and loan. And they have the housewarming. George gives Mr. Martini a bottle of wine. His wife gives Mr. Martini some bread, and it looks good because George is building this development in town, and people are moving in and getting houses with their families, and that's very successful. But we know that George is not really making a whole lot of money out of this. He's mostly just kind of doing it to help out the local folks. And his friend, who is a lot more successful than him, his friend Sam Wainwright, shows up in a car kind of unexpectedly. And Sam Wainwright had the hots for George's wife at one point, and understandably so, because can I just say that Donna Reed is just super hot in this movie. She's a very beautiful actress. I know she had a TV show later that I never watched, but in this movie she's just radiant, and we can see why George would sort of stick around in town if he got to marry Mary is her name, Donna Reed's character. And she's just beautiful, and she's very funny in the movie, and very natural. And anyway, Sam Wainwright, the annoying friend of George Bailey, shows up with his wife or girlfriend, and they're going down to Florida, and they ask George to come. And George, of course, can't go because he's busy with the business. And his friend Sam just kind of says, "Oh, George, it's still got the nose to the grindstone, huh?" And so he takes off, and George stays at home. And as Sam is pulling away, George walks over to his car, and the door is open to his car, and he just kind of kicks it in this very frustrated way. I just think it's a great touch in the movie. I don't know if that was scripted or not, but it's just one of the things that really adds to the movie and the authenticity of it. But what is one of the most dark points in the movie, and not the scene where George thinks about killing himself, although that is a pretty dark scene, but there's a longer scene when, after George thinks he's going to go to jail, and he knows that his uncle has lost the money that they needed to deposit at the bank, and George goes home, and he doesn't tell anyone what's happened. He doesn't tell his wife that, yeah, honey, we lost $8,000 today, and because there's a discrepancy in the books, I might go to jail, and the assessor is in town looking for me, and Mr. Potter wants to throw me in jail, and just want to let you know that tomorrow I might be in jail. No, he doesn't say anything, and his wife knows something's wrong, but George kind of huffs and stomps around the house, and it's really a great scene in terms of the escalating frustration on George's part, that he is about to lose his shit, but he wants to appear as normal as he can around his kids and around his wife, but the wife is no dummy, and she knows something's wrong. George just won't say it, and he kind of goes through the house, and everything starts annoying him. The kids are annoying him. The very things in the house are annoying him. There's this rail on the banister that always comes loose, and as he goes up the stairs, it comes loose on him, and he almost flings the little knob from the banister across the room. And one of his sons comes up to him at one point and says, "Dad, you should see the neighbor's car." And George just kind of says, "What's the matter with our car? Isn't it good enough for you?" And he just explodes on this kid, and the kid looks, genuinely scared of his dad. And the scene just keeps building and building. At one point, there's one of the kids playing this piano riff over and over, this Christmas song, and Jimmy Stewart just loses his shit and starts throwing stuff around the room, and it's kind of a terrifying scene, and again, very real. But George Bailey, being George Bailey, he stops after this tirade, and he kind of says, "I'm sorry. sorry, I lost it, but it's just, he was so scary. His wife just kind of tells him, you need to get out of here for a while. And so that's when he leaves the house and eventually goes to the bridge and thinks about killing himself. And again, for a Christmas movie, this is pretty dark stuff. But really, I think it does add to the movie in the way that A Christmas Carol, which is very dark too, especially toward the end when Ebenezer Scrooge sees the Ghost of Christmas Future. It's very dark. But I think a lot of the better Christmas movies do have kind of an element of darkness to it. Even something like A Christmas Story about Ralphie and getting his BB gun is very kind of dark at times. But it's a Wonderful Life. It's a great movie that, again, I watch for what it says about working class people and getting by in America, and how we make certain compromises, and some of us might have high aspirations, but you'll reach a point in your life where you just say, well, I'm doing okay. I'm not doing as great as I would like to have, but I'm in this small town and doesn't have a lot of opportunity, and there were some things I could have done, but I made a different choice, and here I am. And it's not the kind of movie that people make anymore, and that's too bad. It would be nice if we had, well, not only great new Christmas movies. There aren't a lot of great Christmas movies to go around. A Christmas Carol's been done in so many different ways with Albert Finney and George C. Scott and Kermit the Frog and all these different incarnations of it. But something like It's a Wonderful Life is very unique, and I hope they don't remake it. That would be unfortunate, I think. But it would be nice if they maybe had some movies that did speak more to what average people are going through. And again, to get back to the Rocky movie that I saw, as melodramatic as the Rocky movies can be, it is in a lot of ways about a working class guy and his struggles. And as we look toward the new year, as we look to 2016, it is a presidential election year, and we have a lot of candidates, especially on the Republican side, vying to be the most powerful person in America and indeed the world. And I hope that anything that we've been hearing about class is not just an aside for these debates and for the political discourse and for all the things that we're going to hear in the next year, but it is going to be a priority for whoever's elected. And I hope that people who are struggling will elect someone who legitimately cares about them. I mean, it's probably asking too much that we get a Jimmy Stewart type, but I certainly don't want to see a Mr. Potter type elected. And I've been hearing far too much lately that sounds like Mr. Potter, and not enough that sounds like Jimmy Stewart. And I don't mean to be overly optimistic or Pollyanna-ish, but I would be really nice if we had someone that was maybe talking a bit more about the common people. I know Bernie Sanders has. I don't know. Obviously, I don't think Bernie Sanders has a chance in hell of getting elected, but it's at least nice to kind of hear something from him. I don't know if even if he did have a chance, if he could kind of be the full package that would be electable. But we are going to get someone, and I hope that person has a legitimate love for their country and a love for its people, because we don't want a racist megalomaniac who's just saying things to get headlines. And I think you know who I'm talking about. But I've heard a lot of stupid things being said by more than one candidate. And I think there are people out there with real problems that need real help. And I'm not saying that I have the answers, but I know these things do need to be addressed. Things like, how people get health care, how they have their kids cared for, how they pay down their college debt, how they pay their way through college generally, and just having a living wage. And here I go, I'm probably sounding like a bleeding heart, but I think this stuff goes beyond party, and it really should, because these things are important, and there's 300 million of us. And if most of us can agree that even though unemployment is 5%, people are still having trouble, and there's a lot of places in America that need help. I hope that'll be communicated, and we can think about some things that'll change what we are as a country. And so this is Christmas, and it's a time of year to think about not only what you've gone through this year, but what you're planning on next year, and thinking about family and where you're at in life. And so it's a time for reflection. And again, we watch movies because they're entertaining, but we watch the great movies because they really say something to us. And I think there are a few great Christmas movies out there that I'll keep going back to again and again. So that's my spiel this time in American Rambler. I am grateful for all of you who listen. I will be back soon with another podcast. I think I might go down the history road a little bit on the next one, a little bit more than I have been. I know I talk history, but I've been talking a lot about movies, and I might change gears a bit. So please tune in, and I will be with you soon. Thanks. Take care.